Sarah Mitchell stared at her reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror of the small-town diner where she worked double shifts 6 days a week. Her brown hair was pulled back in the same simple ponytail she wore every day, and her uniform dress hung loose on her thin frame. At 26, she had convinced herself that she was nothing special to look at. Just another face in the crowd of Cedar Ridge, Montana. The dinner rush was starting, and Sarah could hear the familiar sounds of boots scraping against the wooden floor as ranchers and farmhands filed in after a long day of work. She had served most of these men for 3 years now, taking their orders with a quiet smile and refilling their coffee cups without being asked. They were polite enough, but Sarah never caught any of them looking at her the way they looked at the other waitresses. "Sarah, table 6 needs their order taken," called out Martha, the head waitress who had been working at the Rusty Spoon Diner for nearly 20 years. Martha was a kind woman who treated Sarah like the daughter she never had. But even Martha's gentle encouragement couldn't shake Sarah's belief that she was destined to remain invisible. As Sarah approached table 6 with her notepad ready, she noticed a man she had never seen before. He sat alone, his weathered cowboy hat resting on the table next to a pair of worn leather gloves. His dark hair was slightly messy from the hat, and his blue eyes seemed to take in everything around him with quiet observation. He wore a simple flannel shirt and jeans, but there was something about the way he carried himself that made him stand out from the usual crowd. "Good evening. What can I get started for you tonight?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper as she avoided making direct eye contact. The stranger looked up at her, and for a moment Sarah felt something she had never experienced before. His eyes seemed to see right through her carefully constructed barriers, as if he could read every insecurity she had ever felt about herself. "Well, I was hoping for a good meal and maybe some friendly conversation," he said, his voice carrying a slight Texas drawl that made Sarah's heart skip a beat. "What would you recommend?" Sarah found herself stammering as she explained the menu items, her usual confidence completely shaken by this man's direct attention. When she finished, he smiled at her in a way that made her feel like she was the only person in the entire diner. "I'll take the chicken fried steak with mashed potatoes, and I'd like to know your name if you don't mind sharing it," he said, his tone gentle but confident. "It's Sarah," she managed to say, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "Sarah, that's a beautiful name for a beautiful woman. I'm Jake Thompson, and I just moved here from Texas to work on the Henderson Ranch." Sarah felt her face burn with embarrassment. She was certain he was just being polite, the way customers sometimes were when they wanted good service. No one had ever called her beautiful before, not even as a casual compliment. "I'll get your order right in," she mumbled. Practically fleeing to the kitchen, Martha noticed Sarah's flustered state immediately. "Who's the cowboy at table 6? I've never seen you turn that shade of red before." "It's just a new customer," Sarah replied, trying to sound casual while her hands shook slightly as she clipped the order to the kitchen window. "Honey, that man hasn't taken his eyes off you since you walked away from his table. Maybe you should pay attention to what's right in front of you for once." Sarah glanced back at table 6 and caught Jake watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. When their eyes met, he didn't look away like most people would. Instead, he gave her another one of those smiles that made her feel like her heart might stop beating altogether for the rest of the evening. Sarah found excuses to walk past Jake's table. She refilled his coffee 3 times, brought him extra biscuits he didn't ask for, and lingered longer than necessary when she finally brought him his check. Each time, he engaged her in conversation, asking about the town, her recommendations for places to visit, and her opinion on everything from the weather to the best fishing spots in the area. What surprised Sarah most was that Jake seemed genuinely interested in her answers. He listened intently when she talked, asked follow-up questions, and shared stories of his own life in Texas. He told her about growing up on his family's ranch, about losing both parents in a car accident 2 years ago, and about his decision to start fresh somewhere new. "I've been looking for a place that feels like home," he said as the diner began to empty out. "Something tells me I might have found it." The way he looked at her when he said those words made Sarah's stomach flutter with emotions she didn't know how to handle. When the last customer finally left and Sarah began cleaning up, Jake stood to leave but stopped at the counter where she was counting her tips. "Sarah, I was wondering if you might like to have dinner with me tomorrow night. Somewhere nicer than this place, where you can sit down and let someone else do the serving for once." Sarah's heart pounded so loudly she was sure he could hear it. Part of her wanted to say yes more than anything she had ever wanted in her life. But the voice in her head, the one that had been telling her for years that she wasn't pretty enough or interesting enough for someone to notice, spoke louder than her hopes. "I appreciate the offer, but I don't think that would be a good idea," she said, not trusting herself to look at him. "Can I ask why not?" Jake's voice was gentle, not pushy or offended. Sarah took a deep breath, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "Because I'm not the kind of woman that men like you ask out. I'm too plain, too boring. You'll figure that out soon enough, and I'd rather not waste your time or embarrass myself." The words hung in the air between them, and Sarah immediately regretted being so honest. She expected Jake to make some polite excuse and leave, confirming everything she believed about herself. Instead, he was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with those penetrating blue eyes. "Sarah Mitchell," he said finally, his voice firm but kind, "I think you've been listening to the wrong voices for far too long. Would you mind if I shared my opinion on the matter?" Before Sarah could respond, Jake continued, "I've been all over this country and I've met more women than I can count. Pretty ones, sophisticated ones, ones who could talk your ear off about any subject under the sun. But in all my travels, I've never met anyone who made me want to stick around a place just to see her smile again." Sarah felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She wanted to believe him, but years of feeling invisible had built walls that couldn't be torn down with a few kind words. "You don't really know me," she whispered. "Then give me the chance too," Jake said, placing a gentle hand over hers on the counter. "One dinner. If you still think you're not worth my time after that, I'll respect your decision. But Sarah, you're selling yourself short, and I'd like the opportunity to prove it to you." Sarah looked down at his hand covering hers, feeling the calluses that spoke of years of hard work and honest living. Everything in her wanted to say yes, but the fear of disappointment, of proving herself right about her own inadequacy, held her back. "I need to think about it," she said finally. Jake nodded, removing his hand but not stepping away. "That's fair. I'll be back tomorrow night for dinner. If you've changed your mind, just let me know. If not, I'll enjoy another good meal and the pleasure of your company, even if it's just while you're working." He left a $20 tip on a $15 meal and walked toward the door. Just before he left, he turned back one more time. "Sarah, just remember that sometimes the way we see ourselves and the way others see us can be completely different. Don't let your fears rob you of something that could be wonderful." After he left, Sarah stood in the empty diner for a long time, his words echoing in her mind. Martha emerged from the kitchen where she had been pretending not to eavesdrop on the entire conversation. "That man is smitten with you, honey. And from what I could see, you're pretty taken with him too." "He'll change his mind once he gets to know me better," Sarah said. But her voice lacked the conviction it usually carried. "Or maybe you'll change your mind about yourself," Martha replied wisely. "Sometimes it takes someone else believing in us before we can believe in ourselves." That night, Sarah lay awake in her small apartment above the town's only bookstore. Replaying every word of her conversation with Jake, she thought about the way he had looked at her, really looked at her as if she was someone worth seeing. She thought about his gentle persistence and the sincerity in his voice when he told her she was beautiful for the first time in her adult life. Sarah allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to be seen as desirable, to be chosen by someone like Jake Thompson. The possibility was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. As dawn broke over Cedar Ridge, Sarah made a decision that would change the course of her life forever. She was going to say yes to Jake's invitation. Even if it meant risking her heart in ways she had never risked it before, the next evening couldn't come fast enough. And yet Sarah spent the entire day wishing she could stop time. She had agreed to step out of her comfort zone, but she had no idea that this decision would lead to discoveries about herself that would transform not just how others saw her, but how she saw herself. The woman who had spent years believing she was too plain to be, notice was about to learn that sometimes the most beautiful thing about. Sarah spent the entire next day in a state of nervous energy. That made it impossible to concentrate on anything for more than a few minutes at a time. She had called in sick to work, something she had never done unless she was genuinely ill, and instead spent hours trying to figure out what to wear for her dinner with Jake. Her wardrobe consisted mainly of work uniforms and casual clothes that prioritized comfort over style. She owned exactly 2 dresses that weren't part of her diner uniform, and both made her feel awkward and self-conscious. After trying on every possible combination of clothes she owned, Sarah finally settled on a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes and a pair of shoes that didn't make her feel like she was playing. Dress-up. As 6 o'clock approached, Sarah found herself standing in front of her bathroom mirror again. But this time she was really looking at herself instead of just going through the motions. Her hair, when freed from its usual ponytail, fell in soft waves to her shoulders. Her skin was clear and healthy from years of simple living and honest work. Her eyes, which she had always considered unremarkable, seemed brighter somehow, reflecting an excitement she hadn't felt in years. Jake had asked her to meet him at Morrison's, the nicest restaurant in Cedar Ridge, which wasn't saying much in a town of fewer than 3,000 people. Morrison's was where people went for anniversary dinners and graduation celebrations. And Sarah had never set foot inside despite living in town for 3 years. When Sarah walked through the restaurant's front door, she spotted Jake immediately. He was sitting at a table near the window, wearing a clean white button-down shirt and dark jeans. His hair was neatly combed, and he had shaved, revealing a strong jawline that made Sarah's knees feel weak. When he saw her, his face lit up with a smile that made her feel like the most important person who had ever walked into that room. Jake stood as she approached the table, and Sarah noticed that several other diners turned to watch her walk across the restaurant. For once in her life, the attention didn't make her want to disappear. Instead, she felt a small surge of confidence as Jake pulled out her chair and helped her sit down. "You look absolutely beautiful, Sarah," he said as he took his seat across from her. "That blue brings out your eyes in the most amazing way." Sarah felt herself blushing again, but this time it felt different. Instead of embarrassment, it felt like warmth spreading through her entire body. "Thank you. You clean up pretty well yourself," she managed to say. Surprising herself with her ability to return the compliment, the dinner conversation flowed more easily than Sarah had expected. Jake told her about his first week working on the Henderson Ranch, describing the other ranch hands and the challenges of learning a new operation. He spoke about the cattle with genuine affection and knowledge, explaining the differences between breeds and the seasonal rhythms that governed ranch life. Sarah found herself sharing stories about her own life that she had never told anyone before. She talked about growing up in a series of foster homes after her parents died in a house fire when she was 12. She described the college scholarship she had earned but couldn't use, because she had no money for living expenses or books. She told him about her dream of someday opening her own small restaurant where she could create the kind of warm, welcoming atmosphere she had always wished she could find for herself. "Why haven't you pursued that dream?" Jake asked, his attention completely focused on her answer. "Because dreams like that are for other people," Sarah said automatically, then caught herself. "I mean, I don't have the money or the experience or the connections. I'm just a waitress in a small-town diner." Jake leaned forward across the table, his expression serious. "Sarah, can I tell you something my father used to say to me when I was young and thought I wasn't good enough for whatever I wanted to achieve?" Sarah nodded, captivated by the intensity in his voice. "He told me that the only difference between people who achieve their dreams and people who don't isn't talent or luck or connections. It's believing they deserve what they're working toward. He said that when you don't believe you're worth something good, you won't fight for it the way you need to fight." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow because they rang so true. How many opportunities had she missed because she assumed they weren't meant for someone like her? How many times had she stepped aside for other people because she believed they deserved chances more than she did? What if he was wrong? Sarah asked quietly. What if some people really aren't meant for big dreams? Then explain to me why you light up when you talk about cooking, Jake said. Explain why your whole face changes when you describe the restaurant you want to open. Explain why you remember every customer's favorite order and go out of your way to make sure they feel welcome in a place that isn't even yours. Sarah stared at him, shocked that he had noticed so much about her in such a short time. You pay attention to people in a way that most folks don't, Jake continued. You see what they need before they know they need it. That's not just a skill, Sarah, that's a gift. And gifts like that aren't given to people who are meant to hide them under a bushel. As the evening progressed, Sarah began to see herself through Jake's eyes, and the picture was completely different from the one she had carried around for most of her adult life. He saw her kindness to difficult customers as strength, not weakness. He saw her attention to detail as valuable professional skill, not obsessive behavior. He saw her careful savings and modest lifestyle as evidence of discipline and planning, not proof that she was boring. When Jake walked her home after dinner, they took the long route through downtown Cedar Ridge, passing the empty storefront that Sarah had secretly imagined turning into her restaurant. Without thinking, she slowed her pace as they walked past the large front windows. This is it, isn't it? Jake asked softly. This is where you picture your restaurant. Sarah nodded, feeling foolish for being so transparent. Tell me about it. What would you call it? What would be on the menu? Against her better judgment, Sarah found herself describing her vision in detail. She talked about calling it Sarah's Kitchen and specializing in comfort food made with fresh, local ingredients. She described the warm yellow walls she would paint, the mismatched vintage tables and chairs she would collect, and the chalkboard menu that would change with the seasons. Jake listened to every word, asking questions that showed he was taking her dream seriously. By the time they reached her apartment, Sarah felt like she had shared more of herself in one evening than she had in the previous 3 years combined. Sarah, I want to ask you something, and I want you to really think about your answer before you give it to me, Jake said as they stood at the bottom of the stairs leading to her apartment. Okay, Sarah said, though her heart was pounding again. If you knew for certain that you couldn't fail, what's the first step you would take toward opening your restaurant? Sarah thought for a moment, surprised to find that she had an immediate answer. I would talk to Mr. Peterson about the rent on that storefront and see if he would be willing to work out some kind of payment plan. And what's stopping you from having that conversation? Because what if he says yes? Sarah said, the truth spilling out before she could stop it. What if he actually gives me a chance and I mess it up? What if I'm not as good as I think I am? What if people don't like my food or they think the whole idea is stupid? Jake stepped closer, close enough that Sarah could smell his cologne and see the flecks of green in his blue eyes. And what if you're better than you think you are? What if people love your food and your restaurant becomes exactly what this town needs? What if you're the one who's been stupid for believing you don't deserve good things? Before Sarah could respond, Jake leaned down and kissed her gently. It was the first time anyone had kissed her in over 2 years, and it was nothing like the awkward, fumbling experiences she had known before. This kiss was tender and sure, conveying feelings that neither of them had put into words yet. When they broke apart, Sarah felt like the world had shifted on its axis. Everything looked the same, but she felt fundamentally different, as if Jake's belief in her had awakened something that had been sleeping inside her for years. I should go inside, Sarah whispered. Not because she wanted to, but because she needed time to process everything that had happened. I know, Jake said. But Sarah, promise me something. Promise me you'll at least think about talking to Mr. Peterson. You don't have to do it. Just promise me you'll consider it. I promise, Sarah said. And she meant it. As she climbed the stairs to her apartment, Sarah felt like she was floating. When she reached her door and turned back, Jake was still standing at the bottom of the stairs, watching to make sure she got inside safely. "Jake," she called down to him. "Yeah?" "Thank you for seeing me." "Thank you for letting me," he called back. That night, Sarah lay awake again. But this time it wasn't anxiety keeping her awake. It was possibility. For the first time in her adult life, she allowed herself to imagine a future that was bigger than just getting by. She imagined herself as the owner of a successful restaurant, as a woman who was confident in her own abilities, as someone who deserved love and partnership with a man who saw her true worth. The next morning, Sarah called Martha and asked for TH. The conversation with Mr. Peterson went better than Sarah had dared to hope. The elderly man who owned half the buildings on Main Street had been watching the empty storefront sit vacant for 8 months, and he was eager to find a tenant who would bring life back to the space. When Sarah nervously approached him about her restaurant idea, his weathered face broke into a broad smile. "Sarah Mitchell, I've been eating your pie at the diner for 3 years, and I always wondered when you'd get smart enough to go into business for yourself," he said, adjusting his glasses to get a better look at the young woman standing in front of his desk. "You'd really consider renting to me?" Sarah asked, hardly daring to believe it. "Consider it? Honey, I'd be a fool not to. This town needs a place like what you're describing, and you've got the skills to make it work. The question is, do you have the guts to see it through?" Mr. Peterson offered her terms that were more generous than anything Sarah had imagined possible. He would lease her the space for 6 months at half the normal rent, giving her time to build up her business before taking on the full financial commitment. He even offered to help with some of the initial renovations in exchange for a promise of free coffee and pie for a year when Sarah walked out of Peterson's hardware store with a signed lease agreement in her hand. She felt like she was living someone else's life. 3 days ago, she had been convinced that she was destined to remain invisible and unremarkable for the rest of her life. Now she was a business owner with a real chance at making her dreams come true. Her first instinct was to find Jake and share the news with him. She knew he would be working at the Henderson Ranch, but she had never been out there before. The ranch was 5 miles outside of town, and Sarah didn't own a car. Without hesitating, she borrowed Martha's old bicycle and pedaled out to the ranch with a determination she had never felt before. The Henderson Ranch was bigger than Sarah had expected, with pastures that seemed to stretch for miles in every direction. She found Jake working with a group of other men near the main barn, helping to repair a section of fence that had been damaged in the previous week's storm. When Jake saw her approaching on the bicycle, he dropped his tools and jogged over to meet her, his face showing concern and curiosity in equal measure. "Sarah, what are you doing out here? Is everything okay?" Instead of answering with words, Sarah pulled the lease agreement from her purse and held it up for him to see. Jake's expression changed from concern to amazement as he realized what he was looking at. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with pride and joy. "You actually did it." "I did it," Sarah repeated, still hardly believing it herself. Jake picked her up and spun her around, and Sarah laughed with pure happiness for the first time in years. When he set her down, they were both grinning like children who had just discovered the best secret in the world. "Tell me everything," Jake said. "I want to hear every detail." As Sarah described her conversation with Mr. Peterson, she watched Jake's face light up with enthusiasm for her success. He asked practical questions about her timeline, offered to help with the renovation work, and suggested local farmers who might be willing to supply fresh ingredients for her menu. "There's something else," Sarah said when she finished telling him about the lease. "What's that?" "I want to ask you something, and I want you to give me an honest answer." Jake nodded, his expression becoming serious. "Do you really think I'm beautiful? Or were you just being kind because you felt sorry for me?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with those blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "Sarah Mitchell," he said finally, "you are the most striking woman under the heavens. And it has nothing to do with kindness or pity." "But I'm so ordinary," Sarah protested. "I'm not like the women you see in magazines or movies. I don't have perfect skin or perfect hair or a perfect figure." "You're right," Jake said, surprising her. "You're not like those women at all. You're real. You're kind without expecting anything in return. You work harder than anyone I've ever met, and you still find time to care about whether a lonely old rancher gets his coffee refilled without having to ask. You light up when you talk about things you're passionate about, and you make everyone around you feel important. Jake paused, reaching up to brush a strand of hair away from her face. But if you want to talk about physical beauty, let me tell you what I see when I look at you. I see eyes that sparkle with intelligence and warmth. I see a smile that makes me want to spend the rest of my life figuring out new ways to make it appear. I see hands that create beautiful things and comfort people who are hurting. I see a woman who carries herself with grace even when she doesn't realize how graceful she is. Sarah felt tears streaming down her cheeks. But for once they weren't tears of sadness or embarrassment. "How can you see all that when I've never been able to see any of it?" she asked. "Because sometimes we're too close to ourselves to see clearly," Jake said. "And sometimes it takes someone who loves us to show us what we really look like." The word love hung in the air between them, and Sarah felt her heart stop beating for a moment. "You love me?" she whispered. "I've been in love with you since the first night I walked into that diner and watched you take care of everyone around you while trying to make yourself invisible," Jake said. "I love your kindness and your determination and your dreams. I love the way you blush when someone pays you a compliment and the way you remember everyone's favorite pie. I love that you're brave enough to take risks even when you're terrified. And I love that you're finally starting to see yourself the way I've seen you from the beginning." Sarah had never heard words like those directed at her before. She had spent so many years believing that love was something that happened to other people, something she wasn't attractive enough or interesting enough to inspire. Now here was this incredible man telling her that he had fallen in love with all the things about herself that she had tried to hide. "I love you too," she said, the words feeling strange and wonderful on her tongue. "I think I loved you from the moment you told me I was beautiful and actually meant it." Jake kissed her again, and this time Sarah didn't feel any hesitation or self-consciousness. She felt beautiful and loved and worthy of every good thing that was happening to her. Over the following months, Sarah threw herself into preparing her restaurant with an energy and confidence she had never possessed before. Jake helped her paint the walls the warm yellow she had envisioned, and together they scoured antique shops and estate sales for the mismatched furniture that would give the place its welcoming character. The people of Cedar Ridge watched the transformation with growing excitement. Sarah had been serving many of them for years, and they knew her cooking was exceptional. Word spread quickly that Sarah Mitchell was opening her own place, and people began stopping by during the renovation to offer help and express their eagerness for the grand opening on the night before. Sarah's kitchen opened for business. Sarah and Jake sat in the empty restaurant, surrounded by the fruits of months of hard work. The yellow walls glowed warmly in the soft lighting. The vintage tables and chairs created cozy conversation areas throughout the space, and the open kitchen allowed diners to watch Sarah work her magic with the local ingredients she had sourced from farms throughout the county. "Are you nervous?" Jake asked, taking her hand across one of the small tables. "Terrified," Sarah admitted. "What if nobody comes? What if the food isn't good enough? What if I've made a huge mistake?" "Then we'll figure it out together," Jake said simply. "But Sarah, look around you. Look at what you've created. This place is amazing, and tomorrow night it's going to be full of people who have been waiting for exactly this kind of restaurant to open in their town." Jake was right. The grand opening of Sarah's kitchen exceeded every expectation Sarah had dared to have. A line formed outside the restaurant before the doors opened, and every table was full within 30 minutes. People raved about the food, praised the warm atmosphere, and told Sarah how proud they were of her for pursuing her dream. Martha was there, beaming with pride as she watched her former colleague command her own kitchen with confidence and skill. Mr. Peterson came for dinner with his wife and made a point of telling everyone within earshot that he had known Sarah was destined for great things. Even some of the ranch hands from Henderson's spread came into town to celebrate with Jake and Sarah as the evening wound down and the last customers lingered over coffee and dessert. Sarah stepped outside for a moment to catch her breath. She looked through the large front windows at the busy restaurant that bore her name. Watching people enjoy meals she had prepared in the space she had created, Jake joined her on the sidewalk, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "So, how does it feel to be the owner of the most popular restaurant in Cedar Ridge?" he asked. "It feels like I'm living someone else's life," Sarah said. "6 months ago, I was convinced that I was too plain and too ordinary for anything good to happen to me. Now I'm running my own business and engaged to the most wonderful man I've ever met." Jake had proposed 2 weeks earlier, presenting her with a simple but beautiful ring that had belonged to his grandmother. Sarah had said yes without hesitation, knowing that she wanted to.